G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at the race week preview and my final thoughts ahead of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix this coming weekend, the last race week of the season. Looking forward to closing out the fantasy season on a high. As always, for the probably one of the last, if not the last video of the fantasy season for this channel. If you're new around here, you're enjoying the content, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. I cannot reiterate how grateful and thankful I am for all of your support throughout the season. It has been an incredible journey so far, and I'm really looking forward to running this back in 2024. So as always with these videos, we're going to take a look firstly at the chip usage, which I think is going to be a pretty brief rundown given it's the last race of the season, and then go into the talking points. We will tackle my team selection dilemmas very briefly at the end of the video, but I have also recorded a team selection video for this week, so check that out if you haven't done so already. So chip usage, I think for most of you, if not all of you watching this, have just about used all of your chips at this point in the season. I have actually got my wild card still to use because of how useless a chip it has been this season, with, in many cases, many weeks, we've had 3 trades up our sleeve. So decided to pull the trigger on it. I may as well. And given that I've got Ferrari in my team as a constructor at the moment, McLaren coming back onto the radar potentially opens the door for a couple of extra trades, which I perhaps may not have envisaged after Las Vegas. But we'll get into that in a second. For those of you that still, for whatever reason, have the extra DRS boost or your limitless chips, you might have already used it on your team 1, but feel free to throw it down on your team 2 or team 3 if you're running multiple teams. I think you may as well just get them out of the way because they are the 2 most powerful chips in the game. Most people use them on sprint races, but obviously given it's the last race of the season, just get them out of the way. I think as far as autopilot's concerned, a couple of people I think still have that up their sleeve. Still a great chip to have. I still fully expect Max to come away as the top scorer at a circuit he's raced at and has a very good record at. But if you do have multiple potential highest fantasy scorers in your team, that could look like a Verstappen, a Norris, a Sainz, a Perez, even Leclerc, any combination of those drivers, perhaps even throw Alonso into the mix. All drivers that have in their own right had driver of the day nominations, and as a result of that being the highest scoring fantasy driver that weekend. So if in practice we see, the Ferrari drivers, Alonso, Norris, for instance, looking good, slap it on them if you haven't already. But I still think it's a foregone conclusion. Max just looks in a class of his own, and he's out for blood. I believe there's a couple more records he could break on the weekend. So I fully expect he will be front and center of the fantasy landscape. For the wildcard, as I pointed out, I've used that, or I've currently got it active. I'm going to probably make at least 3 trades, so the chip use is vindicated, no doubt. If you're looking to make more than 2, if you've still got it, great. But I still think for those of you that ran Ferrari in Vegas, for those of you that are still on McLaren, they're both constructors, which I'm going to cover in a moment. That could do very well at Abu Dhabi for various reasons. So I don't think there's necessarily it's a bad option carrying either of those 2. But if you find you're taking a -4, -8, and you've still got wildcard up your sleeve, then just slap it on. Final fix. Typically used when you find your driver, a driver of yours has a terrible qualifying, or you're worried that they're going to lose positions in the race. You could also use it as a third trade in many respects. For instance, if you have Carlos Sainz, and we saw back in, what race was it? It was the last couple of races where he had that fuel issue, didn't end up racing. Final fix was a great use of that chip then. So you could, if assuming you have enough budget, bring him into your team instead of, bring Perez into your team instead of Sainz if we saw something like that happen again. But just make sure if you want to have that 3rd bonus trade up your sleeve, or 4th bonus trade if you're carrying 3 into the deadline, just make sure you've got enough budget to have that flexibility to move in and out of drivers. And then no negative, as we know, great to have in your pocket in the event that your drivers are going to get a bunch of DNFs. I'm not so sure Abu Dhabi is going to have that many, but again, if you've got it, it's the only chip left, you may as well use it. So yeah, that's obviously a very brief chip usage section, but I think rather arbitrary given most of us watching this are on our last or have already used all of our chips. So thought I'd race straight into the talking points for this week. There's quite a few to go through, certainly more in depth than perhaps the chip section, but The first thing I want to cover is first practice one on the Friday. For just about every team, there should be a reserve driver stepping in to fill one of the seats for that first practice session. We've got, and I'll bring it up on the screen here because at least it'll give you guys a little bit of a visual as to who we expect, but I'll read them out anyway. So Red Bull, both seats are being occupied by rookie drivers or reserve drivers in Hayyar and Jake Dennis. For McLaren, Pato O'Ward will be sitting in, Zach O'Sullivan for Williams. Robert Schwartzman, he ran previously or earlier in the season for Ferrari, so he makes a return to that car, as does Felipe Drugovich. Jack Doohan for Alpine, Porsche for Alfa Romeo, and Ollie Behrman, who had a really good outing for Haas in Mexico, also makes his return. So you kind of put, 10 inexperienced or new drivers into these cars. We're not going to really have a very useful benchmark for the remaining 10 drivers that are going to take to the grid on the Sunday. I really think it's a pretty pointless session. I'm almost certain if I can't tune in, I won't. But at the same time, great to see these young guys getting a chance. I think, it's really exciting when you see a couple of them put in some excellent times to mix it up with the big boys up the front. So obviously a great and exciting time for them, but doesn't really help us much at all when formulating our decisions, because even if we saw someone like Oscar Piastri running P1 against 10 other junior drivers, where would that stack up against someone like Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez, Charles Leclerc, or drivers that would potentially be sitting out first practice one? So just keep that in mind for FP1 if you see a few faces up the front that you just don't ordinarily see there. The next thing I wanted to cover was Ferrari's recent history at Abu Dhabi. So they're coming off the back of a really great result in Las Vegas. Charles Leclerc, P2, and then Carlos Sainz had that really good drive from P12 back into the top 5. And that could have been a podium for sure had he, not started so far back, which was obviously outside of his control from what happened in that free practice one session. But Sainz, notwithstanding that, has had points finishes in his last 6 races at Abu Dhabi. He also rounded out a 3rd place in the 2021 season finale behind Max and Lewis, and then came 4th there last year with 23 points. So he's got a lot of confidence he can take from this circuit. I don't know necessarily if the circuit will favour the Ferrari quite as much, and we'll cover that off shortly, but I do think Sainz is the man in form, or a man in form at the moment, just has a consistent run of results. If we go over to Fantasy Tools at the moment, I think I pointed this out briefly in my team selection video. If you look past his Qatar issue, that didn't come to mind before. Qatar was where he had the race he couldn't start because of fuel issues. If you put that aside, he's had some sensational drives all the way through to Las Vegas. 18 in Japan, his lowest score, but a boon of 30+ point performances, 3 in a row between the Netherlands and Singapore, and then this run of consistency since Austin. So he's not looked out of place. He's been arguably better value for money than his teammate, despite the fact that Charles Leclerc did have his best fantasy performance of the season in Las Vegas. So Carlos Sainz is, safe as houses, in my opinion, a really good driver, a really consistent driver. And at, $20 odd million is an awesome alternative to someone like Lando Norris, someone like Sergio Perez, and certainly George Russell too, if you want to bounce around between those options. So Sainz obviously got a great record in good form. So yeah, certainly one to keep on your radar. As for his teammate, Charles Leclerc, 41-point performance. As you can see here on the screen, Fantasy Tools, a great result for him, and can take, again, much like Sainz's recent form, that kind of confidence into the last race of the season. Charles at Abu Dhabi, also some great records. He's had a 2nd place last year, 2022, 3rd in 2019, and last year in the closing race of the season where he finished 2nd, he came away with 47 points. Obviously slightly different to how the scoring was done in 2023, but being the highest point scoring driver that weekend, obviously a great sign. Not to mention the fact that he's had 3 of the last 4 poles of the last 4 races. So even though he may not be able to convert it to a race win, which seems to be the story of the season for him at the moment. He hopefully can put himself in a position to at least challenge for the race win. We saw that in Vegas. Obviously, I think the circuit worked in favor of that Ferrari and the straight line speed, but he can take solace from the fact that he knows on his day he can mix it with Max up the front. Not to mention that he also had, as you can see here, his driver of the day win. He was the first non-McLaren driver to win the award since Carlos Sainz went back-to-back in Monza and in Singapore. Lando Norris had the previous 3. Oscar Piastri had the 2 before that. So a good sign that someone other than one of the papaya can actually win that nomination. And, given the fact that Sainz won the 2 before Piastri, makes me think that, there's a bit of voter fatigue when it comes to the Red Bulls and maybe even the Mercedes. So keep an eye on your Ferrari and your McLaren assets as potential driver of the day nominations. The other thing I'll just point out is that Ferrari do have a lot to race for this weekend. I fully expect they're going to push as hard as they can to beat out Mercedes in the Constructors' Championship, as it's only a 4-point gap separating Mercedes and Ferrari are the team in form at the moment. So I fully expect that they're going to give everything they've got, even though there are some track characteristics at Yas Marina that I don't think will necessarily work in favor of the team in red. But notwithstanding that, I think they are a team that's continually built on good performances since about Monza or so. So fully expect at least 1, maybe 2 Ferrari assets will be in my team for this weekend. As far as the track characteristics are concerned and who or what to expect from teams and drivers heading into this weekend, Abu Dhabi is a very high downforce track, very different to what we saw in Las Vegas, where it was, I guess, a lower downforce setup, a lot of straight lines. And I think, as we've seen so far this season, those higher downforce tracks do work in favor of the McLaren, the Aston Martin, and even the Mercedes, all teams that do run those higher loaded setups. And I think we will see McLaren come back onto the radar in a couple of practice sessions on Friday and Saturday. I think Fernando Alonso deserves to be in the conversation as well. And then I know Mercedes have probably regressed a little bit in the last couple of races. George and Lewis in Brazil and Las Vegas have just not featured on the fantasy radar at all after a couple of really good drives from them in Mexico and the US, notwithstanding the fact that Lewis was ultimately disqualified in Circuit of the Americas. But I do think Mercedes will be out to, as much like Ferrari, finish the season on a high and really give everything they've got to finish second and hold off the men from Italy. So I think Mercedes, definitely keep an eye on them, given the twists and turns that we have, that we will see from this circuit. But I think because of those lower, medium, and even higher speed corners, starting in Sector 1, I think qualifying, you'll want to, at least for the drivers, they'll want to control a lot more of the sliding of the tyres, prevent that overheating early in the lap. You get to the second sector, where I think Ferrari, Red Bull, maybe even Williams, although we didn't see a great performance from them in Las Vegas. You got 2 very long DRS straights. Most of the overtakes will happen there when that rear wing opens. And then you go into the third sector, and there's probably a little bit more precision required to navigate a few more of those turns heading into the end of the lap. So I think, Ferrari is going to perhaps be quite strong through the second sector, but we might see McLaren, Aston Martin, Mercedes do quite well through sectors 1 and 3. So, yeah, it's going to be a really interesting race, and I think there's a lot of different team selection dilemmas, a lot of different variables in play here. In terms of Ferrari, I guess we've talked about them a little bit already, but Frederick Vasseur, he is quite pessimistic after the performance they put in Vegas. He said they're not going to be quite as competitive just because of the lower number of straights at Abu Dhabi compared to Las Vegas. To the contrary, Andreas Stella, however, he is certainly much more buoyant about McLaren's chances. They're quite positive with regards to the car setup. And he thinks they'll be certainly mixing it up with the boys at the front of the field compared to, say, what we saw from them in Las Vegas. Another popular fantasy asset or assets to own are Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo. Tsunoda's been quoted as saying that AlphaTauri are going to have a few more upgrades coming for this weekend, even in the last race of the season. So fully expect he'll be looking to bounce back. Even though he had 14 points in Las Vegas, Tsunoda probably will want to, again, maintain that consistency. We've seen 5 double-digit performances in a row from Yuki. it's a kind of run of form I've seen from him in fantasy and in general that I just perhaps haven't seen from him at all in his 3 seasons of racing in Formula One. So I think AlphaTauri are a team to watch, and I would love to see Daniel Ricciardo close the season out with another really good points finish, much like what we saw in Mexico. And then obviously I've got on the screen, a lot at stake. I've already talked about Mercedes and Ferrari for second in the in the Constructors' Championship. As far as the drivers, fourth is up for grabs. Carlos Sainz and Alonso are tied on 200. Norris 5 points behind on 195. So anything could happen, and all drivers that are on their day, absolutely brilliant. So I think with all this still to play for, I know it's not the World Championship like we saw 2 years ago, but it is for these drivers in particular that are battling it out. Definitely going to mean something. So I think it's going to be a really fun race, and I definitely think we could see a few surprises. So I'll bring my team up on the screen here. I talked about it, as I said, in my team selection video in great detail, but let's just refresh it for a little bit. I think this was my team I had in Las Vegas. I think this is a really good build, really well balanced, a bit of Ferrari, a bit of Red Bull. I think Red Bull are going to continue to be very good at Abu Dhabi. The car is, as we all know, the most well balanced and most high performing car on the grid. So assuming Checo can continue his little purple patch of form at the moment, even though he seems to make a habit lately of getting beaten out on the last lap, I think he could certainly factor into the conversation for me. There's another Ferrari build I've got my eye on, if not for this one, and that could be if I really like Charles Leclerc. There's, a case to be made that he is slightly more explosive as a driver, even though he hasn't really had the season he's wanted, and being a little bit further behind his teammate is probably weighing on his mind just a little bit. But I think if I really like the look of that, I obviously can't afford anyone else, but as I said, Lando Norris and McLaren should be able to deliver hopefully a bit more than what we've seen in Las Vegas, and obviously he'll want to make amends for that DNF too. So I have just enough to get in Nico Hülkenberg. I know he's not exactly screaming fantasy potential, but he has had a couple of moments of brilliance in fantasy this season. So as long as he can, rack up 10 points or so, I don't think that would be a bad outing at all. So I really like this team, assuming Lando looks good in practice. But I guess on the topic of the McLaren constructor, and I'm still in two minds as to whether or not I want Ferrari or McLaren in my team, they do enable, $8 million more worth of budget to pivot into another build or various other builds. So for me, Leclerc perhaps can't feature as heavily in this build because it prohibits me moving to drivers, say like Fernando Alonso or Oscar Piastri, as opposed to an Alex Albon, for instance, who I don't think is going to do quite as well at Abu Dhabi. So if I got Carlos Sainz back in here, that gives me the flexibility to go for Fernando Alonso or Oscar Piastri, depending on who I like more. But I think what I like about having McLaren as constructor, it gives you this kind of, you can triangulate who goes into these 3 slots here. You could go Carlos Sainz and Lando Norris and George Russell. You go Carlos Sainz as I had. You could go Sergio Perez. You could go, instead of Oscar Piastri, you could go to Fernando Alonso. Instead of Lando Norris, you could go up to Carlos Sainz. So it gives you a lot of versatility with the McLaren constructor to get in, 3 guys in different slots that you could really all see scoring very highly on the weekend. So, it's really alternating 2 of Sergio Perez, Carlos Sainz, and Lando Norris, and alternating 1 of either Fernando Alonso or Oscar Piastri. I really like that versatility. I think another thing to be said for the McLaren constructor, which I haven't talked about enough so far, is that they have had the most fastest pit stop points among all teams since Austria, which is remarkable given how impressive Red Bull are at that as well. They've had 81 points, which is ahead of Ferrari 62 and Red Bull 59. I'm surprised Ferrari have outscored Red Bull since Austria as well, but just something to keep in mind there. I know they aren't expected to be perhaps quite up the front given their recent performance, but I definitely am quietly confident that McLaren could have a good weekend. But if you are a little bit lower on budget or you want a little bit more flexibility with who you want in your 5-driver slots, then McLaren certainly opens the door and has that fast pit stop upside too. So a lot to think about, and I wouldn't say I'm by any means settled on my final lineup now. I will be back for a deadline stream on FanAmp where I will obviously discuss what my dilemmas are heading into the qualifying deadline, and I'm sure we will address all different combinations here. But on the deadline. But Adam and I are going to be live for the very last deadline stream of the season on FanAmp. There are details of that on my Twitter page. Subscribe to their YouTube channel. All of the details for that are going to be in the description below for this video. So feel free to drop by for one last shebang for fantasy for this season. It's going to be a lot of fun. We've got a few special guests, 1 or 2 you may already know, 1 or 2 you may not, that are going to drop by too. So really looking forward to having them on the show. They're experts in the fantasy game, and I think your advice or their advice is going to be very welcome too. So I'm really excited for this last show. It's going to be an awesome fun 60 minutes. So drop in if you have the time. But I think I'm going to leave it there, guys. It is my last preview and final thoughts video for the season. So a little sad, but I'm almost certain I'll be back for a season recap video after the race weekend. And that will probably do it for this season. But again, I cannot reiterate, like I said at the start of the video, how grateful and thankful I am to have the support from you guys throughout the season. It's been an absolute whirlwind journey, but I'm super, super pumped for what 2024 has in store. So thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate the support, and I'll see you all very soon.